Hello, and welcome to Making Sense of It. I am Mona Duncan, your moderator. This program is our gift to you from the Glasser Institute for Choice Theory. And each week we have a certified member present some of the concepts of reality therapy and choice theory. And we are blessed today to have with us Associate Professor Dr. Anthony
West Hartman.
Dr. Wesley Hartman, and he is the associate professor with Amaridge University in Montgomery, Alabama. And he's going to be talking with us today about the prolonged effects of trauma and how that affects our life. And so welcome everyone that's here. And Dr. Hartman, welcome, and ready for you to take it away.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay, let me unshare. Okay, good. Hopefully you can see the screen or the PowerPoint. All righty, thank you. This morning, I'd like to really go over some of the research that I conducted during my PhD program. And I took this research and I went ahead and published it in the spring 2022, this past spring, in the Reality International Choice Theory Journal. So if you're interested in it, you can go and read the full-length journal article. But broke it down just so that we can go over some of the aspects of our research. Very fascinated with it. I was before I decided to go into counseling, I'm a professional counselor, a professor counselor. I work a lot with first responders. And since I was a retired law enforcement officer, I was very interested in studying the population. And so I set out to look at vicarious trauma in law enforcement populations using the lens of choice theory. And I stumbled across something that I found to be fascinating because it supports a lot of Dr. Glasser's theory, and in an area which I originally did not even consider would surface during my study. Let me move some here. So prolonged exposure to traumatic events impacts spiritual interpersonal relationships. Now, I was really looking at the prolonged exposure and really trying to figure out what does it impact. And what I found is interpersonal relationships were impacted on a world, a community, and a family level. And we're going to dive in and just take a little quick look at some of these different levels where it was impacted. Now, on the screen here, you'll see these little bubbles. And what I'm really looking at here is the law enforcement officer's perception, their optimism, support systems, family relationships, spirituality, and interpersonal characteristics. These all serve as protective factors when a person is exposed to trauma. And I have a little quote, and hopefully you can read it there on the slide. I'm not going to read through the quote by Dr. Glasser. But really, Dr. Glasser really highlighted the fact that relationships are significant in our life. And he really put a lot of emphasis on the love and belonging aspect of our basic needs. And I really found this to be true when looking at people exposed to trauma. Now, these interpersonal relationships, it served as an improvement in work and off-duty environments. The interpersonal relationships also improve relationships in the areas of spirituality as far as goals and expectations. But there's also a negative perception of people and society that also can result after being exposed to trauma. And trauma that we're talking about here is work-related trauma. The officers that I interviewed, participants, didn't necessarily experience the trauma firsthand, but day in and day out in their work, repeatedly, going from incident to incident, scene to scene, constant exposure to traumatic events throughout their lives. And on this little circle here, I'm sort of going to try to look at it through the lens of choice theory. The officer, they're exposed to some traumatic event, and their knowledge and value filters, which is their perception of spirituality, their practices and beliefs that they carry with them on the job. It's a part of their daily life. And then you have the prolonged exposure to that work-related trauma. Now, the LEO stands for law enforcement officers. The LEO's perceived world. Now, they're going through their day and their perception. They're getting it through their five senses. This is their perception. And then they also had their quality world image. In this case, I'm really looking at the spiritual quality world image that the officers had. Now, what would happen is comparing their perceived world to their quality world, oftentimes it produced frustration signals. And because what they were experiencing in the real world, their perception of it, did not match their quality world image of spirituality. And this sent a frustration signal out that really impacted their total behaviors, their feeling, physiology, acting, and thinking. And I studied that and took a close look at how they would report how it impacted different areas of their life as far as with their behaviors and their perceptions. And in just about every case, the officers turned around and had goals. They had goals that they wanted to improve different aspects of their spirituality and also their relationships. So I sort of broke it down, looking at it through the different lenses of choice theory, really looking at the knowledge, the value filter, their perceived world, their quality world, and those frustration signals that were produced. Now, the knowledge filter and the value filter. Every law enforcement officer, and the ones especially that I interviewed, and I went to 5 different geographical locations around the country. Some of them were in populated areas, and some were in very rural areas in different agencies. To get a good sense of how, is this a generalized thing? And pretty much they all reported back the same thing. But every LEO has a unique experience. It's based upon their perceptions from the real world through their 5 senses, forming that perceived world image. And our sensory system filters the input that we receive from the real world, that perceptual system, and interprets that information. Now, our knowledge filter compares that received information to everything that we've learned and everything that we've experienced over our life. And that information is either going to be, when it goes through the valuing filter, it's either going to be meaningful, it's going to be pleasant, or it's going to, when it passes through, it's going to have some meaning associated with it. And once it passes through that valuing filter, it's going to be pleasurable, positive, painful, it could be negative, or it could be just neutral. And moral and spiritual issues experienced by the law enforcement officers were linked to their knowledge filters and their value filters. And it really determined for them, what is important or unimportant, meaningful or meaningless, as they were exposed to a lot of these traumatic events. Now, the perceived world. The officers reported the negative aspects of society, seeing people, oftentimes at their worst while performing law enforcement duties, caused a lot of negative change in their spiritual and interpersonal perceptions. And these negative perceptions really have impacted them on the world, as far as their whole worldview of people in general, the community that they were living in. And also, it really impacted them on the family level. And a lot of them reported it was an eye-opening experience for them to see everybody at least 90% of the time in their worst moments. Now, we generally go through life and as we're interacting on a daily basis, we don't see people all the time in their worst moments. Now, we might see it from time to time, but they reported about 90% of the time, people that they were working with were at their worst moments. And it really impacted their perception. And really observing what happened to people behind the scenes really played a heavy part. Some of the officers reported that they were naive to what was happening in the world around them before they actually went into their law enforcement careers. And again, that daily witnessing these negative aspects of society produced for many of them a wavering spirituality. It really shifted a lot prior, as it was prior before they went into law enforcement work. A lot of the incidents such as murder, rape, child neglect, abuse, even torture, caused a transition from a sense of innocence once they started experiencing this on a day-to-day basis. And dealing with people's troubles really led to avoiding interacting with people when they were off duty. Now, I found this to be very interesting because a lot of times they were very active in their community, with their churches, with different organizations. But after this exposure, they tend to withdraw. They did not want to associate themselves anymore with people. A lot of times they no longer would attend whatever meaningful function that they were going to prior to exposure. And it really became harder and harder for them to trust people. And it resulted in a lot of guardedness when they would interact with people. And we're talking about not while they were necessarily on duty, but on their off-duty life on a day-to-day basis. And some officers reported that stereotypes that they may have held prior to entering law enforcement work, and for many of them, they were trying hard to get these stereotypes out of their life. But it was actually reinforced when they went on the job. So that was actually a negative aspect for them, something that troubled them, that things that they were trying to rid their life of were coming back. So that was a negative aspect. The quality world, which is this, it was very, what I found was very consistent with the tenets of choice theory. The participants reported an incongruence between their perceived world and their quality world spiritual image. And these perceptions, when they were looking at it from religion, strong systems of belief, well, it was reported as a part of their quality world, especially prior to coming on to law enforcement. And perceptions of the quality world image and spirituality were affected by this exposure. Previously held spiritual practices and beliefs were sometimes altered by this experience. Sometimes people would, or some of the officers would report, if there is a God, then why is bad things happening? So they really started to challenge a lot of these beliefs that they had. In several cases, the officers would change from one religious belief to another religious belief. And in a sense, they were searching to find meaning by actually trying to change their spiritual beliefs in the process. And a lot of this prolonged exposure resulted in an incongruence between what choice theory describes as the perceived world and the quality world spiritual cognitive image that the person would have. So that's how the quality world sort of factored into this, and really looking at it from their spiritual quality world. And the frustration signals that resulted from it was due to this incongruency between the quality world and the perceived world, produced those frustration signals. And it was expressed as what could be termed as spiritual distress. And we may have run across people suffering with some type of spiritual distress, but that's how they described it. It was a spiritual distress. And it was really due to their inability to satisfy the need to connect with belonging, or to connect and belong to something beyond themselves. And the authors really started to describe, and I was mentioning the fact of the world. You have the world, the community, the family level of connections. Well, the authors were also reporting that their sense of connection to their higher power, to God, to the deity, that they may have felt that connection before, they were losing that connection. And that sent a pretty strong frustration signal. And from those quality world images, spiritual images that they once held on to. And moral decisions were often, based on the pre-existing schemas that align to choice theory's concept of that quality world and perceived world, total knowledge filter, value filter. So a lot of the authors went into their work with these pre-existing schemas, and the exposure to the trauma definitely played a heavy toll on trying to sort out their quality world and the perceived world. So a lot of frustration was reported with the officers. And we come down to the relationships. And long ago, Dr. Glasser stated that any psychological problem is related to a relationship issue. Now, this is when I pointed out that this was a finding that when I went into the study, I wasn't expecting to really have the officers report to me that it was their relationships that were impacted. Now, it doesn't surprise me in hindsight, comparing this research to Dr. Glasser's work, that relationships would surface to the top. I was looking at other areas of, thinking other areas of their spirituality would surface out of the findings. But that relationship, you stop and think about it, that relationship from a spiritual lens is a relationship, a connection to that higher power. And so that's really why I think every one of them, out of all the officers, 90% of them actually reported that relationship issue that they were having. And some of the problems that they were running into was they were trying to look at these interpersonal relationships in their off-duty and their on-duty life, and how it impacted community, family interactions. And there was always an attempt reported of trying to gain an internal sense of control in their lives when it's centered around their relationships. And this attempt to gain that control over the relationships resulted in a negative perception of people, that perceived world, and their distress in the negative perception of not matching the relationships they want in that quality world. So they were trying to regain that control over all the relationships that they felt that they have lost. And again, oftentimes their attempts were not successful. A lot of the officers reported failed marriages, issues with their children, issues at the community level, interacting with people off duty. They reported not being connected and actually withdrawing and stop attending religious practices, churches, things like that. So it was really causing a lot of hardship in their day-to-day life. And according to Dr. Glasser, suffering considerable disability after trauma is usually due to not having strong relationships and perhaps not engaged in what they consider valuable. And that makes perfect sense, looking through the lens of what these officers were experiencing. Because after they experienced the trauma, their strong relationships were no longer strong. Or maybe perhaps they were not even strong to begin with. And that's something that I didn't explore, but that might be good for another study. But they were definitely considered valuable to them, or they would not have reported them as often as they did. And references to interpersonal relationships while discussing exposure to trauma is consistent with choice theory due to choice, sense of purpose, responsibility, those interpersonal relationships being linked to one spirituality. Now, when we think about spirituality, um, the different definitions that were given to me during the study really opened my eyes. How people would actually describe spirituality. It's just not just a simple, well, I believe in a deity or a higher power or a God. It was more of a all-encompassing type of a definition that they would provide. So I found that to be very interesting. And you look at the goals. A lot of the officers reported goals as far as future spiritual goals to improve those interpersonal relationships. Just about every one of them wanted stronger relationships. And they always associated this with the incongruence between their perceived world and their quality world image. They were, there was a lot of concern over the welfare of suicidal law enforcement officers. And it really reflected a lot on their basic need for that love and belonging, and also their power. In other words, a power to be successful, or to be able to achieve some sense of success in keeping their fellow officers safe. There's feelings of a lack of control over a situation, denied the satisfaction of the need to have power, which we just talked about, which is personal power, those abilities to make choices. Oftentimes they felt like they were robbed of the ability to make the choices. Now, as a reality therapist and ones that have studied choice theory, we know that that's not necessarily true, but that was their perception of a loss of power. And the goals were very specific to what the officers felt. They had some level of control to make meaning of the chaos they worked with every day. So they wanted to try to make meaning of it, in their life on both a spiritual and an interpersonal level. They really wanted to focus on that, which I found it very interesting that just about every officer I interviewed came up with very interesting goals on how they wanted to improve things, but it always went back to relationships, which I found to be fascinating. Some of the implications for practice, and this is something for those of us that are clinicians, we're working with mental health. We really want to sort of pay attention to what our clients are reporting to us. Exposure to traumatic events, from what I found in the study, had a tremendous impact on the perceptions of spirituality, interpersonal relationships. It was areas of conduct and motivation. And many officers reported how it impacted their overall mental health and well-being. Some participants perceived a moral injury after their deep spiritual and those moral convictions that they hold on to, expectations, general acceptance of society have been negatively impacted, which is consistent with a lot of previous research that's been conducted. But I would suggest there's a need for a protective factor of spirituality to be addressed with clients. And that can be challenging today because a lot of institutions, organizations, try to shy away from discussing spirituality with our clients, the people that we're working with. But in this case, since those interpersonal connections and being connected to their spirituality, all these interpersonal connections, I think it's something really to address. There's an estimated of 250,000 first responders in the United States needing treatment for some type of trauma disorder. We always talk about PTS, different types of disorders that could come from exposure to trauma. That's a large number. And really developing prevention and treatment programs that incorporate some of these domains of spirituality is very, very crucial in the sense when you're looking at the rate of suicide, there's been a 25% increase in law enforcement suicides since 2012. And that number is expected to continue to climb. And one of the challenges is how do we remove the stigma associated with seeking out mental health? And oftentimes, this stigma can be associated with work discrimination, treatment being considered an indication of personal failure, and even the organization even questioning the person's fitness for duty. And 85% of law enforcement officers, do not disclose any type of mental stress they may be feeling due to the fact that they may face this type of workplace discrimination or the fears they might have of losing their job. So anyway, this is a presentation I wanted to present today to really take a look at how exposure to trauma can really impact a person's connection with others and with their higher power on a family level, a community level, and even a worldwide level. So thanks for being here for my presentation.
Well, thank you, Dr. Hartman. We appreciate that very much. You want to go ahead and close down your screen so we can just talk?
There you go.
There you go. And the whole time you were talking, I kept thinking of the story of the Good Samaritan.
Mm-hmm.
And, in that story, there was someone that was attacked and robbed and mutilated and left to die on the side of the road. And it was a kind of maybe not a well-traveled road, but over the course of the day, 3 upstanding citizens walked by and saw that person bleeding and dying and walked on and did not do anything to help. And then someone who was perceived as being hated by the whole community has compassion on someone that was hurt and doctored him up and took him into a place for someone to really take care of him.
Mm-hmm.
And I was seeing, as you were talking about both sides, the perceived world is the way we see everything as being, whether it really is or not. It's our viewpoint of it. And the quality world is the nirvana that we're wanting.
Mm-hmm.
But whenever there's that disconnect, sometimes we can see that police officer as being the devil himself. But as we can begin to see that police officer that hated Samaritan was the one that showed compassion to having worked in the federal prison system for 20 years, I can see what hate there is toward public officials. But if you can see that they're there really to help, they are there to help. And it can be an enlightenment on both sides, that someone would come and help me. But what I'm saying is that it would be an enlightenment to your police officers, your law enforcement officers, that even though they may be off-putting toward you, it's giving them a new change that someone could be kind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was actually an area that quite a few of the officers reported was a lot of them went into law enforcement work because they wanted to help people in many different capacities. In many different capacities they wanted to help. And the fact that they were getting all the negative pushback, all the criticism from the general population that they were trying to serve actually caused a lot of frustration, because again, it goes back to their quality world and their perception of what's going on, and in this case, their perception of how the community was treating them. So I think you're definitely on a good path there.
And if we can change our mind all the time. That's part of choice theory. So we have the theory is that we can change our mind. And as we can begin to change the fact that even though this person was still off-putting to me, I'm still showing the kindness that maybe would resonate with them or their family or with, bystanders that was around, that could begin that micro began changing of seeing them as helpers as opposed to intruders.
Very correct. Mhm.
Can I chime in?
Well, when we close the airways. And then also looking at the different filters. Dr. Hartman, can you just go briefly about how how does the filter work? Does it take everything out, or does it just reduce the level of?
Well, it's the ulcers, and I guess this would apply to anyone. I mean, we're going through the world that we live in, that real world, and we're receiving that information through our five senses. And once it enters our brain from our five senses, we have that knowledge filter, everything that we've learned about whatever it is that we're experiencing. And so it's going to go through that filter. Now, some of the information might not pass any further. We really don't have to really think about it. It's not something significant to us. It doesn't have any meaning. But the information that does have meaning on a variety of different levels, once it passes through that knowledge filter, we identified it, we know what it is that we're looking at. It goes to our valuing filter, where we'll attach a value to it. It's going to be something positive. It could be pleasurable. It could be something painful, very negative, or it could be something that, again, it could be neutral. And if it's neutral, it's not really going to impact our perceived world that much. Now, the pain or the pleasure in our perceived world, now we're going to be comparing that to our quality world image. And that's where those frustrations are going to come out. The further away we are from our quality world image, the more frustration we're going to have, because that need is not being met, or that want is not being acquired. So I really found it interesting that when you're looking at spirituality as being a major part of our value filter, what they were experiencing violated the tenets of their spiritual belief almost on a daily basis, which is it's quite significant when you're looking at that perception. And then the frustration signals that were being sent to the behavioral system were pretty strong levels of frustration.
Right, right. Well, thank you very much. This is an excellent presentation, and your ad-libbing the valuing system and the filtering just made it so clear. So thank you very, very much. And thank each of you for being here, and hang around, because we're going to open it for a conversation and asking questions or making comments to Dr. Hartman. In the meantime, have a great day and many blessings.